From the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
Hey, everyone. Good morning, gang. How is everyone doing on this lovely Tuesday morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are watching us live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube? It's March 9th, 2021. We have a great practitioner brief today. For the first time, the inaugural guest episode kicks off today. So a lot of weight is on the shoulders of my guest today. A lot of weight because he's the first guest. He's the first guy coming on. No pressure at all on Skyler when I bring him up here in just a moment, folks. We got a lot of stories to talk about today, by the way, from a GitHub authentication bug. We're going to go into the Exchange issue with Microsoft, and we're going to talk a little bit about Supernova and China. And, you know, I hate to say I've been talking about this, but I've been talking about this. So we'll get into that. If this is your first time tuning in or watching, please comment and subscribe. You can comment live right now. We will feature your comments on the show. Today's show is supported by our friends over at Wistic. You don't want to miss out. Next week, March 17th, our awesome webinar links are in the show notes, or if you're watching us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, it's right there. Click on the link, sign up for our awesome webinar, Securing the Supply Chain, with our friends over at Wistic, Chris Roberts, Gray Meyer, Gleaves, the CISO over at Hollard Insurance. It's going to be an awesome panel discussion on St. Paddy's Day, March 17th. So you'll want to tune in to that. Now, joining me on the stream today, the one, the only, Skyler Sampson. Skyler, what's happening?
Good morning. How are you?
You know, I'm doing very well. So Skyler is the senior security engineer over at Gremlin. Skyler, thanks for coming on and being my first guest on the Practitioner Brief guest segment.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on. So let's get kind of if you don't mind, just give our audience kind of a quick overview about your background, just so that they know who's really speaking to them.
My name is Skyler Sampson. I worked for RSA for a bunch of years on BSafe's backend, and from there moved from development into security, and have worked for a couple other small companies, AOL, Yahoo, also Vivint, and now Gremlin. Awesome.
So before we get started, though, Skyler, you'll join me for our ceremonial sip of coffee, my double espresso. What are you drinking out of your invisible mug today?
Cold brew we did the last night.
A cold brew. I'm such an espresso guy. It's very hard for me to drink cold coffee.
Makes sense.
it's difficult. I don't know. All right. So, folks, Skyler and I are going to get into a few stories here. I want to kind of start off with this one. We won't dig deep into it because its impact is really, really low. It's just something that's went on for about a month on GitHub, which was essentially a really serious authentication bug. It's not potentially serious. It's extremely serious. And while extremely rare, nonetheless, it took place for nearly 30 days before it was patched up. So the vulnerability, which GitHub said existed at various times between February 8th and March 5th, was caused by a race condition that is extremely rare circumstances, results in a user session being routed to the browser of a different authenticated user, providing the second user with a valid unauthenticated session cookie for the first user's account. This issue was dealt with according to Mike Hanley, who's the new CISO over at GitHub. Hanley said that they learned about the issue as a result of an external report about anomalous behavior. Less than 0.001 of authenticated sessions on GitHub were impacted by this, according to the company. So, you know, nothing too serious there, just something to be aware of. Skyler, let's get into the stuff you and I really want to talk about, which is Microsoft Exchange server fallout continues. The federal government is in now full investigative assessment mode. And the newest victim of this is the European Banking Authority, which is now disclosing that the Exchange server hack took place. And as a result of that, the EBA took down all email systems. So how do they talk if they took down email systems? Like, they go back to like good old landlines. Klaus.
Over avian carrier.
Yeah. Maybe they started sending pigeons in the office, right? Like, here's a note. In-office mail has become a thing again. They've taken down their email systems after their Microsoft Exchange servers were hacked as part of the ongoing attacks targeting organizations worldwide. The EBA is part of the European System of Financial Supervisions, and it oversees the integrity, orderly functioning of the EU banking sector. The agency has launched a full investigation and is in close cooperation with its ICT provider, a team of forensic experts, and other relevant entities. Skyler, let's talk a little bit about this Exchange vulnerability. What can you kind of share about that?
Okay. Really, it comes down to there were 4 CVEs published by Microsoft that ended up leading to a chain attack that would allow full RCE capabilities on Microsoft Exchange servers. This really comes down to the fact that whatever your system you're using for running that Microsoft Exchange server, attackers can gain access to run any command that they want from the command line within that environment, allowing them to then use that as the jumping off point to get further into your environment.
Yeah, yesterday I reported on the Practitioner brief that, some experts say that there's 30,000 companies impacted by this. How widespread do you think this is, Skyler?
Anyone who really uses Exchange Server is possibly vulnerable to this. It really comes down to if you had an Exchange Server running between that period, it was February 26th to March 3rd before the patch came out. And anytime that Microsoft comes out with a patch out of band anyway, you kind of want to perk up and pay attention to what's happening there. But you'll see that during that time, you can probably assume that you were hit if you didn't have it shut off during that time. It turned into a full mass scan environment once that vulnerability really started getting exploited. And then you saw a lot of scanning across port 25 during that time as well.
So when we talk about kind of a little bit of the mitigation of this, what are some of the ways you kind of come at it from an engineer perspective? What are some of the we often talk about patching and we say all you have to do is patch, but you and I both know it's not always as simple as hitting update like you would update your phone or computer. There's significant challenges to specific patches because most enterprise systems are interconnected, and taking down and patching one thing could impact business operations. What are some of the ways you've seen or you looked at for mitigation of the Microsoft Exchange Server system?
This is when it really becomes important to see the depth of your coverage. It means that coverage doesn't just happen within, at the endpoint, you're doing your endpoint scanning and that's it. It really comes down to that control over your firewalls, your control over your patching schedule, how well you're able to maintain that. But also it comes to how you're able to see what's happening with your environment. So if you're able to monitor your environment and look for those files, look for things that are unexpected and understanding what those mean, it really comes down to teaching your people and helping your incident response team understand what those indicators of compromise would look like, or what anomalous behavior looks like, and the tooling appropriate for that. Once you have that available to your teams, then they are able to follow up and see what is happening with your environment. And knowing that data really allows you to then protect your environment.
Yeah, to me, I think that the after effects, once this kind of settles and once all the announcements come out, this will put Equifax, SolarWinds, and I think, by the way, this is a direct effect of SolarWinds. Now, there's no concrete proof to this yet. But I think once they kind of get everything patched up and we really start to do the root cause of the breach itself, we're going to realize that this was simply because of SolarWinds. This is, and downstream of this is all SolarWinds.
And that really comes down to knowing your data, knowing your vendors, knowing who's available to you, and keeping an eye on those things, and appropriate compensating controls will help prevent these types of O-days from affecting you. Because patching is great and really gives you 90% of what you need, but these O-days are the real scary ones. Those are the mass exploitation events.
Yeah, they're mass exploitation, and it's a bunch of it's significant because once a vulnerability is disclosed publicly, the bad guys see the same notice that you do, and as you're running to protect it, they're running to get in before you do that. So one thing about this, Microsoft has updated their Microsoft Safety Scanner to detect web shells that have been deployed in these attacks, and a PowerShell script to search for IOCs in Exchange and OWA files. But this is being attributed by ESET and Microsoft to a group in China. There's also other state-sponsored groups that they couldn't identify as of yet. And this is why I think this is kind of going into China here, because kind of in our next thing, we looked at the threat actors that were hiding behind the Supernova malware and SolarWinds are actually linked to China. And so Charity Wright and I, Charity Wright from Recorded Future, we've done, since December to today, we've done 2 different speaking engagements where we said, just because people keep saying Russia doesn't mean it's all Russia. Don't dismiss Russia, but look at China. Some of these IOCs are direct out of China. Skyler, you and I were talking about this kind of before we went live. What are some of the IOCs that really tipped you off that some of this stuff is China?
What you really end up seeing from state level actors is you end up seeing much more coherent attack types. So if you look at a lot of the tooling that was dropped for the NSA, you start seeing that these are specific vulnerability chains attacking popular systems. Individuals and the hacking groups, you tend to see random vulnerabilities from different things. They don't always tend to be the big ones, Exchange, Google, those types of infrastructure environments that most large corporations get. But you start seeing a lot of those vulnerabilities coming out of those vulnerabilities. You start seeing a lot of very complicated supply chain or attacks that are multiple attack types. So as you in the Exchange, for example, there are 4 vulnerabilities that led to RCE. It's not just one anymore. You don't just find one vulnerability that gives you full access to an environment. It's usually that full chain.
Yeah, I mean, there's one aspect to this, folks, that I think is really important to note, which is the following. We know that SolarWinds really started taking place in 2019, around October, November of 19, with actual full access by March of 20, and then discovery in December of 20. And in March of 20, meaning nearly a year ago, while everyone was busy with COVID, these threat actors had access to Microsoft's source code. And so everything you see coming downstream right now, that fact can't be ignored. It can't be something that we overlook and say coincidence. I believe in coincidences, just not that many. I just don't believe that there are that many coincidences. So something to really keep in mind right now, because especially with Supernova, by the way, Skyler, one thing I want to complain about, and maybe you'll disagree or agree with me. Can we please give threat actors one name? I don't want to read 7 names by 7 different companies for one threat actor.
I really think we just need to stop naming vulnerabilities at the end of the day. Stick to CVEs and call it good.
So they're naming the hack. So they're naming the thread group here, right? So the thread group, Microsoft named it Noblium. FireEye calls it UNC 2452. CrowdStrike calls it stellar particle. Palo Alto calls it solar storm. And Velocity calls it dark halo. Can we give someone one name? That's like getting a kid, and you name your kid John. Your mom calls your kid Johnny. Your dad calls your kid Joe. And you're like, what is Can we give the kid one name? One name, please. One name. So the SolarWinds Orion API authentication bypass, which was CVE 2020-10148, allowed the attacker to execute a reconnaissance script and commands and drop the Supernova web shell literally within 30 minutes, as you see right there in front of you. After planning the Supernova in SolarWinds Orion by trojanizing a legitimate file, the platform used the attacker actually used the ComCVS CS DLL library to dump the contents of the local security authority subsystem service. Again, very significant because this is by SecureWorks linked directly to China, and this is really the first public attribution of anything to do with SolarWinds to China, something that we've been talking about since December. And now, finally, as more and more investigations and more companies start to look into this, we're starting to see some of that stuff come true and come to fruition. Folks, that's it for our practitioner brief today. Thanks so much for tuning in. Skyler, thank you for being the guest on our show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure having you, folks. We're all set here. We'll be back with more tomorrow. I've got guests tomorrow and Thursday as well. So this week is a trend. You don't want to miss it. Until next time, folks, make sure to subscribe, comment, share. Let all of your friends know about the practitioner brief. We'll be back with more tomorrow live at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, folks, stay healthy and stay cyber safe. Cheers.
We love feedback, so make sure to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform.